Hey there, I'm Ed Gannon and welcome to The Baby, where we talk about life as the youngest in the family. So today's guest has a really interesting story. Of course, she's the youngest, but she holds a really unique place in her family. Sue, welcome to The Baby.
Thank you, Ed.
Tell us the story of Sue.
Story of Sue. Well, I am currently in my, I was going to say twilight years. It's not twilight years. I'm 55. So many moons ago when I was born, I was actually born into a family of 3 siblings, and my parents already had 3 children, and I was born in Canberra. And the interesting thing that came about, I guess, from my perspective and what's a little bit more unique about my story was that my 3 older siblings were actually all adopted. And I knew about that from as early as I can possibly remember. I happened to just be the only biological child, and as it turns out, I believe I was essentially an accident. Mum and Dad didn't think they could have children. They adopted everybody. And then I came along 7 years later. So there was a gap of 7 years between myself and my second closest sibling, and 10 years between my eldest sibling.
So they obviously had tried.
They had tried, yeah.
Overall.
And that would have been back in the 60s. That was the 60s.
So you wouldn't have had the tests and the advances that we had now.
I don't think so, no. So clearly whatever was deemed to not work did work at some point in time.
So you say you knew that you were from a very early age. Is it just from your earliest memories you knew they were adopted and you weren't, or you were told at some stage, or what?
I don't recall being told. I just know that I knew. So it was something that was always very openly spoken about, but there was no going on about it. It was just I knew that they were adopted and they knew they were adopted, but it was just something that the whole family knew about, and it just happened that I wasn't. So, but it wasn't a big deal. It was always just, that's just how it is, and I believe they were told from as early as they could understand.
Yeah. So tell you were born in, say, Canberra?
Yep.
So tell me about growing up.
It was a funny childhood. I kind of have a 2-part series to my life, I think. Part 1 was born in and lived the first 10 years of my life in Canberra. And Dad was an academic, so he worked at one of the colleges. Mum, I remember returning to work, obviously, by the time I was probably 5 or 6, maybe started school. So she worked part-time. And we had an interesting, fairly, I suppose, middle-class life, but I don't remember having oodles of cash. I think there was always, maybe it was that era that my parents were born in, sort of post, coming out of the war, that they were always cautious with money. But we had I think on reflection, there was a lot of artistic people around us and a lot of academics around us, and that really came about because of Dad's job. So he was sort of the dean, I think, of, the biology unit or whatever it might have been, and he had PhD students that came from all around the world. And we had lots of different nationalities visiting us because there was all the embassies around. So Mum always had a flair for entertaining. So we're involved in, she used to host a dinner party, and her thing was she would have a dish for every person from their native country, so that they felt at home when they came around to our house. So that was really interesting. I think we were exposed to a lot, and I think at an early age, in terms of schooling, we were all state schooled, but it was just an interesting melting pot of people.
Well, you wouldn't need a DNA test to see if you're related to your mother, because that sounds like describe exactly you, because I've been to Sue's place a million times and she is the entertainer and the cooker.
Yes,
I
am a cooker.
A cooker. Not in the modern use of the term cooker. What was it like? You're an interesting one, because I'd say to you, to anyone, what was it like growing up the youngest in the family? But are you youngest in the family, or are you growing up as the only biological child in an adopted family? What was one of them?
I've thought about that a bit myself. I guess I knew it, but it never really was a big thing. So when I tell people, it seems really unique and odd, but we weren't raised like that to think like that. I think probably for me it was just that I was the youngest. Like that ultimately is what sticks in my head, and that there was a decent enough age difference between myself and my sister, 7 years, that felt like I really was the youngest. I was the baby by some many years.
I've spoken to people that were the youngest by a long way, and they say I wasn't the youngest. I was actually an only child.
Yeah, well, I was going to get to that, but yes, correct. I didn't really feel so much the only child in my first 10 years. I do have a slight problem recalling half of it, whether that's just my age now. But when I was 10, the family essentially split in half because Dad got a job in Melbourne. And so by that stage, I had a brother who was 19 and one who was 20, and they decided to stay in Canberra and board at universities. So it was just my sister and I who came to Melbourne, and she was in the terrible time of, being 17 years old, uprooted from her family environment, from her friends at school, didn't want to move, and was already unsettled for whatever reasons, just going through teenage life, I guess. So by the time we got to Melbourne, she really didn't settle and left home pretty quickly. And so I was, from a pretty, early teenage years, essentially an only child.
And so the older boys, they were sort of coming home to Melbourne because Melbourne wasn't their home.
Melbourne wasn't their home.
Canberra was there.
I remember seeing them a lot. We must have seen them on Christmases, and they must have come to visit. But it wasn't until they finished their uni degrees that I think they both came back to Melbourne for brief periods of time. And then one brother took off to Tassie, and he's lived there ever since, and he's now in his early 60s. And one does still live in Melbourne.
And so do you think at that stage, did you know them, did you think, or not?
No, not at all. Not at all. I really don't feel like... I feel like they were... I have memories of them, kind of fond memories of them looking after me when I was under 10 and living in Canberra. I think I was more of a nuisance probably because there was a fairly decent age gap. And I think also in those times with anyone who's got multiple siblings, parents usually go, can you keep your eye on, Sue over there, please, because we're busy. So they had to drag me around, and I know my brothers, certainly my eldest brother, said he used to change my nappy, provided it was only wet, and he remembers feeding me and, carry me around. And I think I got attention because I was much younger and little, but I don't think I was doted on. But I don't really have much. I think there was such a big difference in age in those years that I don't think I really developed relationships with any of them, and haven't done until later in life.
Yeah, because you probably didn't have the sort of the communication that we do have now. Like, you were not on social media and all that sort of stuff, and knew everything about their life in Canberra and whatnot.
Probably not until I was probably about 20, when I, somewhere around 20, early 20s, when I started basically working and living myself out of home, that I really started reconnecting with them as adults. And then that gap seems less, that age gap seems less. And then, of course, you have kids, and then it seems even less. So now I have a really close relationship with my two siblings who have spent most of their time in Melbourne. The one in Tassie, not so much, because I see him fairly rarely.
Mm. Do you think you were treated differently than the other siblings because you were the youngest?
Good question. I think I was probably allowed a lot more freedom once I got to a certain age, and that might have been because no one could be bothered by then worrying about me. I certainly remember doing things beyond my years. Even when I was little, I remember staying up late all the time. I never wanted to go to bed. I was always worried I was going to miss out on something, and I think someone would try to put me to bed, and I'd sneak up and I'd get under the table and I'd watch Number 96 and The Box and whatever they were watching on telly at the time. I was in the lounge room watching it with them until I got caught. And I remember things like going to the high school that my brothers and sister went to, they had a film night. It must have been 1975, I guess. And there was a double feature of Jaws, and That'll Be the Day with David Essex. And I would have been 6 years old. And I don't remember where Mum and Dad were, but I sat and watched both those movies, which were both probably fairly inappropriate for my age. I remember having nightmares about sharks after that. But just things like that, constantly doing things that, like you wouldn't necessarily be entertaining with a 6-year-old. And I definitely have very fond memories of my dad, and I'm not sure what age I would have been, probably about 8 or 9. But on the weekend he would, obviously I'm guessing they were entertaining, and prior to guests arriving he'd open up the teak liquor cabinet and he would ask me what liqueur I wanted.
How old were you?
Probably about 8. And I had a very good vocabulary, and I knew whether I wanted Benedictine and brandy or a Cointreau, and he would give me a little glass and we'd discuss it and talk about it.
So what was your favourite at 8?
I liked creme de cacao. I never know how he said it, with a little bit of cream on the top.
Was that the blue one?
No, that was Curaçao.
Oh, right.
But it was like the kind of chocolatey, maybe coffee one, and you had a little bit of cream on the top. That was a bit flash. But yes, I had like a little thing going there and I just think now, my God, I was probably 8 years old. Anyway, that's what you did.
Would your father have done that with your oldest brother?
I don't think so. I think they missed out on that kind of stuff, and they may not have even known that I did it with Dad, to be honest. But I think they were all so close together that they had that regular sibling rivalry and competition against one another and playing pranks and tricks and getting each other in trouble. And I missed out on all that. I was just the afterthought.
And that was what I was going to ask. What do you think that you missed out on by being the youngest?
I know I missed out on a Hush concert and I was very annoyed. Things that I thought I was old enough to go to. There was a Hush concert on at Canberra City Centre, and I remember my two brothers and my sister got tickets, and Mum wouldn't let me go. Probably, for very valid reasons, but I was mortified. So I would have been probably, 7 or 8 by then. I felt like I really missed out on that kind of stuff because I wanted to be included with the grown-ups, and I just didn't get included. And things like, I definitely recall them going out to dinner parties and saying, well, we're going out now and we're leaving you, and, your eldest brother's in charge. Well, of course, I don't think he was in charge. I think he either went out or completely just went to bed, because I definitely recall getting phone calls in the night. Mum and Dad, I always remember saying they rang up to see how we were, of course, on the landlines in those days, about 10 o'clock to say we won't be long home, and I answered the phone. And they said, what are you doing up? And I said, what do you mean? And they said, where's everyone else? And I said, they're all in bed. No one was actually watching what I was doing or really looking after me, but I was just like, oh, well, I'll just do my own thing. But, yeah, I felt like I missed out on those kind of things. You sort of get lumped in and, someone else will look after you.
Do you think your parents' parenting style changed from when they had their first children to you?
I reckon it definitely did. I think so. I don't know how, but I suspect Dad was always actually quite a disciplinarian, and although he had like a really soft side, hence the liquor cabinet, but I definitely think that I probably got an easy ride compared to perhaps being the firstborn, who would have tested the waters a bit. Yeah.
This is the big question. Do you think you were spoiled?
No, I don't actually. I think I got a lot of attention when I was little, and I think it was probably, I'm imagining, a novelty, because all of a sudden there was a baby in the house and that no one expected, friends included. So I think that was kind of cute and fun, and isn't she cute? And I remember my eldest brother saying he felt like I was like a real life doll. He'd just pick me up and take me around the place and, feed me. But in terms of being spoilt, none of us were lavished. I didn't like, none of us got things that we desperately wanted. It was just, I think, the era as well. Like, there wasn't a lot of money, flashed around. We didn't get to do anything remarkable, and I guess having 4 kids back then in the 70s was expensive, and Dad was probably on a, okay wage, but nothing drastic. But I certainly don't remember getting anything I wanted, and I don't remember having hissy fits because I didn't get it. I do remember being upset at times, like I didn't go to Hush concert, but I would have been put in my place.
What happens if I asked your older siblings that same question?
Oh, I think they'd say the same. They would knock me and, give me a hard time to say, oh, you're so spoilt. But I think they do believe and agree that no one was really spoiled in the house. We didn't get lavish with anything. I probably got away with a little bit more. I don't know whether that's being spoilt, but not in a bad way. Like, it wasn't like, I didn't do atrocious things and not get reprimanded or anything like that. There was a reasonable amount of discipline in the house, even still, even though I was, I definitely had my moments where I could get away with a few more things that perhaps my siblings wouldn't have.
And was your parents, if I asked your parents whether they thought they spoilt you?
I don't think they would say they spoilt me, no.
Yeah.
No, I really don't. I think I don't at all. I think they were very deliberate in trying not to. And I think also that might have stemmed a little bit from the scenario with the adopted and the biological. I think they really didn't want to ever play that out. That potential, oh my God, we're spoiling her and what will people think? So I think that was maybe in the back of their minds.
Yeah, because that's my question before, whether the biological child versus the youngest, which one sort of overruled the other, and it's probably the biological thing.
Maybe. It's really hard to, it's hard for me to differentiate because it was always this dual thing that I was brought up with.
Yeah, you're unique. It's very unique.
And I don't really know, but I certainly think, or perhaps I'm putting my own views on it, but if I was in my parents' position, I certainly wouldn't want to, have favourites. I mean, none of us, you don't have favourites with your kids, and you don't want to ever spoil one and not the other. And I think that would have been very obvious and awful had they ever done anything like that. That wasn't in their heads to even think that anyone was different, because we weren't. We were always just, all raised by the same parents.
So if I had a question about how does it, do you think that you treat your youngest differently? The answer is going to be no.
Well, I think I let my youngest get away with a lot more.
Why is that?
It's a good question, isn't it? I think you're just more relaxed. I think. You go, oh, I've been through this already twice. I know how this all plays out. I'm not going to fight it too much. They're good kids. I'll just let that ride.
Yeah.
So I don't really think I don't feel like I'm like spoiling. I've got 3 sons. I don't feel like I'm spoiling anyone in particular, but I think I'm just more relaxed as a parent. I was definitely much more uptight with firstbborn.
Yeah, I think that's natural. Yeah. It doesn't matter. I mean, it doesn't matter if it's just...
Doesn't matter.
The second child's always different than the first one because of the way that works.
Yeah.
So do you think, again, you're unique, but being the youngest, has it defined you in any part of your life, do you think?
I actually think the second part 2 of my life, when I moved to Melbourne, and then I became essentially, for want of a better word, a lonely child.
A Freudian slip, yeah.
I think that defined me because I feel like I really had to make good of it. So, and I do feel that I worked really hard to have other interests, and there was part of I think this is just growing up in general, but there is part of you that wants to please your parents. And for some reason, I think that we all just had this inherent understanding that we were going to go to uni, and I think that was just because Dad was an academic, and no one ever said you have to go to uni, but it was just kind of like it wasn't even a discussion. Everyone just went to uni. Maybe that was just the era, I'm not sure. But I always felt like I had to prove something. I'm not sure. My sister, who's the 7-year, the closest in age to me, she really had a rough time, as I mentioned, coming from Canberra to Melbourne, and she really went off the rails. And I don't know why that is. I don't think she knows why it is, but because she had been so unhappy and had caused, a lot of angst and worry with mum and dad, I really was very conscious of that, and I felt very responsible to not do that. I almost felt like I took on a bit of a grown-up adult parenting role because I could see it was really hard for mum and dad, and I just didn't want to put anyone else through any of that.
She was the youngest.
She was.
For a long time.
She was, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we have spoken about this actually because I think she was, no question, at age 7, very put out when I was born.
Yeah.
Because all of a sudden there's this cute little baby doll and everyone's like, how could this have possibly happened? This is a miracle. I definitely think that it impacted her. There's no question. And then I think probably without getting, way into the depths of it all, one of my grandparents and my father's mother was just not very nice to her. But not nice to her because she was adopted and openly. And I really think that just that barrage of negative commentary that went towards her all happened in those critical teenage years where she's forming her own opinion of herself. And I just think it fundamentally had a massive impact on how she handled the next 10 years of her life. No question.
So what advice would you have for others who are the youngest in the family, or even in situations such as yours?
I think there is an element of just trusting yourself, and I think as from my recollection, I think I was probably, a little indulged and looked after when I was a little, and then all of a sudden everyone just kind of lost interest. It was almost like two extremes, and I think that can be a bit unsettling. So it's hard to develop your own sense of self when you've got other siblings around, and particularly if some of them are bigger and noisier and take up more space and so on. So you just have to find your own thing and just go with it, and whether it's quietly or not. Yeah.
So I'm going to ask you a few things.
Yep.
School, and not so much the first day of school, the last day of school. Did being the youngest, do you think that was different, your last year of school and finishing school, than compared to, say, your older siblings?
Well, it's a little bit of a hard question because when I don't really remember I kind of vaguely remember when my siblings finished school. Certainly my two brothers I remember, but it wasn't particularly exciting, I don't think. They just went straight into college and uni. My sister didn't really finish school, and so that was just a day-by-day scenario, so that was always a bit problematic. I think by the time it got to me finishing school, I really feel like even though I wanted to do well, Mum and Dad had almost just too exhausted to think about it. It was like, thank God we've got her over the line. But no one told me to do homework. No one said, what are you doing? Why aren't you there? I didn't have any of that. I really had to I was very much up to my own devices. And I went through a funny group. I had a very close group of friends at school, and I don't know whether it was because it was 1986, and I was in a state school, I have no idea, but half of them failed. Half of them didn't do any work at all. And I did do work, not as much as I could have, but I went okay. But I just remember them not being unhappy. They were happy I'd finished school. But I remember saying, well, I've done okay. Like half of my friends failed HSC in those days. So, yeah, I don't feel like it was such a big event. I think they just really had lost interest.
What about holidays? Because that's always a big thing about being the youngest. Yeah. A is you're jammed in a car, or yes, you don't do the holidays that you did when they only had one or two children.
Yeah, well, we were pretty fortunate because when we lived in Canberra, Mum and Dad obviously decided they obviously had enough money that they were going to build a beach house. And everyone who lives in Canberra, or many people who live in Canberra, find somewhere on the south coast of New South Wales. And so they looked up and down the coast and they found a little spot, Bermagui, and thankfully bought a beautiful block of land on top of a beach and built a house. So we were so fortunate because it was only a 3-hour drive. So we spent a lot of time there. Summers, I just remember at Bermagui, so we would probably have been there for 2 months, I guess, or 6 weeks at least. We would go long weekends. That was our standard kind of holiday. We didn't really do much else. We certainly didn't all jump on planes and fly to Noosa and Bali. We did have a extended holiday. Well, I would have only been probably 5. Dad took a sabbatical and he went to the States, and I think he must have been doing some research. So he lived in Utah for 6 months. So my siblings all went to school, and I think I went to kindergarten of some description. So that was a big thing. We did a little bit of travelling when we did that, but otherwise holidays were pretty much the one destination. And by the time I went into the second phase of my life, when we came to Melbourne, we still holidayed in Bermagui, but then I was just holidaying with Mum and Dad. That was not fun. And by that stage, also, Mum and Dad's marriage was fairly dismal and they really weren't very happy with one another. So I was allowed to take a friend. So I could ask, and I often had a girlfriend come with us because otherwise I would have just been sitting there on my own. And there was no TV in those days. It was just read a book or play Scrabble. But, yeah, holidays were pretty sparse in that regard.
You had to bring your own sibling.
Had to bring your own friend.
BYO sibling.
Yeah.
What about meal times when you're all there together? And did that happen very often? Can you remember having meal times with all of you there together?
Yeah, I do remember in Canberra. I'm pretty sure meal times were always at the table. We had to sit at the table. It was 6 o'clock, I think, and meal was on the table. In those days, it was pretty standard, meat and 3 veg, and we would talk about what we had done that day. There would always be a topic of conversation. Everyone would be encouraged to talk. So I do remember those reasonably well. And then I'd probably get shunted off to bed fairly quickly, and then I'd sneak out and
watch Number 96, like we all did.
Yeah.
And The Box.
And The Box.
and Homicide in Division 4. What about going out for meals?
Don't really have any recollection of the family eating out. And so that would have been up until, around about 10 years of age. Even when we went to the holiday place, I don't think there was even a restaurant. There might have been a Chinese restaurant. I don't think we ever went there. So I think that was just a financial thing. It was too expensive. But then when I lived in Melbourne with Mum and Dad and I was essentially on my own, we went out nearly every weekend. It became a thing that Friday nights we would go out for dinner. So I got really used to having – that was a bonus. We used to have a nice meal out, whether it was a steak place or a Mexican or Indian. And I think I was actually brought along partly to break the ice between the two of them and have something else to talk about rather than them looking at each other. But that was fun. I used to like that. Yeah, so I got spoilt in that regard because – that would have been in my, late teens when I was at high school.
Yeah. Learning to drive. How old were you when you started to drive?
11. I pretty much could drive when I was 11 years old.
Where would you drive when you're 11?
At the holiday place at Bermagui. I have no idea whether Dad, it was Dad's doing, Mum didn't want to have a bar of it, she'd want to get in the car. I think it really came about because Dad got bored. And we would be at a beach house, and he didn't like the beach, ironically. So if he was bored and he'd read the paper, he'd be looking for things to do. So whoever was around was, taken out to the car. Come on, we're going to go for a driving lesson. So I was driving the Holden station wagon with, manual, stick on the
tree.
On the tree when I was 11. through the state forest, round windy roads. And if we ever went visiting someone who had maybe a property or a farm, he'd just give me the keys and say, yeah, off you go. You can, So there was, but I think that was also the era. I mean, I assume that was what it was like growing up in the 70s in Australia. Just no one thought about it.
Yeah. I remember in grade 6, a girl I sat next to, she told me that her dad had let her back the car down the driveway.
Yep.
And I just couldn't believe it because I used to drive the car to the bus stop, and I'd been driving a car since in grade 1. So I just couldn't. Really?
Well, I do remember continuing the car driving even when we came to Melbourne. We lived in a place that had a big long battle axe block, so that was really fun because I don't know how many. It was probably 70 metres or 100 metres long, and I just used to throttle it all the way up and down the driveway as much as I could if I was bored. It rubbed off.
Is there anything you look back and think, oh, yeah, that happened because I was the youngest?
Well, when I was a little bit older, Mum was a nurse, and I'm not entirely sure whether this is a reflection of me being the youngest, but I suspect it was because she'd gone through this with 3 other kids. But I had a accident when I was roller skating in the speed skating reverse at Roller City, Frankston, on a Friday night. 2 nasty boys ran me over and I fell. I was at a party. It was a 13th birthday party, and I fell over and I came home with a very, very sore wrist and said, I think I've broken my wrist. And Mum, of course, just said, don't be ridiculous. You haven't broken your wrist. And for 2 weeks I limped around with a very sore arm, couldn't write at school. Actually couldn't. It was my right hand. Couldn't write. Was trying to write with my left hand. Finally, one of the teachers rang up Mum and said, I think Sue might need to get an X-ray. And I went down and I had broken my wrist. So it had been 2 weeks later and Mum had completely disregarded me. So that was one episode. I don't know whether that's because I was the youngest, but I suspect there was a little bit of that involved. She'd had enough of it already, enough broken bones. I nearly drowned. When I was little. I was probably maybe 7 or 8 at the beach house, and my siblings had obviously been put in charge of me. When I think back now, I can't believe really that we were allowed to go down to this surf beach on our own, but that's just what you did. You just, off you go, get out of under our feet, we'll see you later. So I went down with 3 of them, and it was a pretty rough beach, still is, and they all went out and I could see them out. There was a sandbank and I was desperate to get out there. I think they must have told me to stay on the sand, and I didn't because it looked like there was a lovely little pool of water, and I thought I can splash around there and I might be able to get to the sandbank. Well, of course, the pool of water was actually a rip, and I went under and I could feel myself going. I actually really panicked, and I don't know how it happened, but there was a man on the beach who just saw it all unfold and came over and just dragged me out of the water. And then, I think my eldest brother he got flagged in and obviously felt pretty terrible because none of them had been paying any attention. And then I think I got taken off to swimming lessons, which I suspect I hadn't really done, and I know that my siblings had. So I think it is definitely another thing, and I feel like I've done this with my own youngest son. We kind of couldn't be bothered in the end, so we didn't quite finish the swimming lessons as well as we should have. I think the same thing happened with me.
Final question. Did you ever get to see Hush?
No. I didn't, and I really wanted to because I love Boney Maroney.
And you're probably a bit late now.
I think so.
I would have thought.
I think some of them might not be alive anymore. I was very upset though.
Sue, thanks for that.
It's a pleasure.
It was fantastic. Great story, but it's such a unique situation and I would find it very hard to meet someone else who's in that same boat as you.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. You grow up with it and you don't really think anything of it, but it is quite unique. I appreciate that.
Yeah, good.
It's been a pleasure.
All right, thank you.
And thanks for listening to us. You can find more of The Baby wherever you found this episode, and you can also find us on Instagram, Facebook and Threads. Get in touch and tell us what you think, or if you're the youngest and you'd like to have a chat, then give us a yell. We'll catch you next time. The Baby Podcast acknowledges the traditional custodians of the land on which it was recorded and pays respects to elders past, present and emerging, as well as all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Music for this podcast is by Serge Havkin Music. The Baby Podcast takes no responsibility for any legal or personal disputes that may arise from this podcast. The Baby Podcast is written and presented by Ed Gannon. This has been a Media Means production.